reflect those of the Black Talk Radio Network and Black Talk Media Project. Black Talk Radio is new black media for the new millennium.
Good morning. It is Tuesday, November 1st. This is Change Matters Solutions. We've got another great program coming at you. We have a special guest that's going to speak with us today. And I am Kenny Hendricks.
Good morning. I am Colette Williams, and this is Change Matters. It is cloudy and cold and I think kind of windy also here in sunny Southern California. We do have a great show coming to you this morning. And our guest is Councilman John J. Kennedy of Pasadena. I love saying that name, John Kennedy. It gives me chills. And the day that I met John Kennedy, I said, oh, my God, you've got to be a great person. So John, I'm sure, he's going to enjoy this show just as much as we are going to enjoy him. John, do we have you? John?
Do you have me?
Yes, there you are.
Okay.
Great. Glad to have you on with us. Thank you for being with us.
Welcome to the show, Councilman.
Thank you.
Thank you. We're all from Pasadena. How great is that? Our mothers would be so proud. Our mothers would just be so proud. I'm sure, as they've said, they are smiling at us and wishing us well and doing great. So, John, glad to have you, as we said. Tell us about yourself, our audience. Tell us about what's going on with you and what we can expect, and we want to get you going. So,
okay. I'd be more than happy to, and I'd like to put myself in context of probably significant numbers of African Americans in this country. My mother is from Mississippi. My father is from South Carolina. They grew up in the cold, hard, mean South, and they moved to California for a better life, and I think that's what a lot of African Americans did. However, when they came here, some of the same Jim Crow laws that they experienced in the South happened to exist in little places like little hamlets, if you will, little towns like the city of Pasadena, where at one time there were about 23,000 African Americans living in a vibrant city with a strong business community, strong residential community, and by design, the African American community in our little city, which is a microcosm of what took place across this country with other cities where you had strong African American populations. By design, the African American community was decimated by freeways, urban renewal, which meant Negro removal, and a whole host of insidious policies that have affected our communities. And so when we see what's happening across the country, it's not just the fault of the black community. You have to recognize it in context that certain policies have had a disproportionate negative effect on our communities, and we're not making excuses. We're just saying treat us fairly, make the playing field level, and life will be better for not just African Americans, but for all Americans. That's all we're saying. So I want to give a little context that I'm a graduate of the University of Southern California. I have a degree in international relations, economics, and a certificate in Defense and Strategic Studies, studying the thermonuclear balance east-west at the time. And I'm a graduate of Howard University School of Law in Washington, D.C., proud graduate, historic in the context of fighting for civil rights for not just African Americans, but for all Americans.
Great. Okay, John, I was just listening to you and thinking about all that you're talking about and all of the things that are going on right now. And it really hits home when you talk about the plight of African Americans. Your parents moved here from Mississippi, and typically when we talk to folks our age, we know that everybody's got parents that came from other parts of the country, the South, the East Coast, and our parents moved here for a better life. Do you actually think that has taken place, or do you think that some way it stopped along the way? Have we gone back, or have we? I kind of feel like we haven't done enough. So where do you think we're going? Where do you think we're going from here?
Well, certainly there has been progress, but the progress has not been significant enough for lifting all of us out of it.
This is Scotty, the engineer. I'm sorry, we were getting some interference off of a line that we could not clearly hear the councilman. Sorry about to interrupt you, Councilman. I just wanted to clear the line. Please continue, sir.
Oh, okay, no problem. So my point is that certainly some African Americans have done well, but in terms of the vast majority of African Americans, we have to figure out how to, one, fight new Jim Crow, two, policies that have a negative impact on black families, three, access to education. The President of the United States and his administration is moving forward in the context of providing free education at the community college level for all people in this country. That is important for the African American community because oftentimes people of color have to work while they're seeking their AA degree, if you will, and their baccalaureate degree. So costs becomes critical in terms of obtaining that advanced degree. Mm-hmm. And so that's a step forward. But there are a whole host of issues that affect African Americans that sometimes seemingly only affect our community, but that's not exactly true. It affects people of color. And there's vestiges of racism in this country that have been institutionalized. It's not necessarily the obvious. It's the subtleties that have a disproportionate impact on our communities. And so we have to be smart. We have to be intelligent. We have to read. We have to listen. We have to share stories. We have to make sure that we use our resources in our communities to make college affordable as it is right now, not hoping for the president's program, but what are we doing right now to help young people lift themselves out of negative situations? Do we need mental health to be on the front burner? I mean, what has happened to the African American over the past 350 years in this country, the fact that we have a president by the name of Barack Obama and we have other African Americans who have excelled in a whole host of various industries is somewhat phenomenal in the context of all the negative things that have happened to us as a people in this country. No, we're not saying that feel sorry for us. We're saying get out of our way so we can excel. Stop doing things that negatively impact the community. Stop new redlining. Stop the insidious behavior as it relates to banking, where loans are not available in our community. We can thrive like everyone else if we're just treated fairly, and that's the issue, being treated fairly.
That is absolutely perfect, just being treated fairly. And we have a lot of things going on in the Black community, and some of the questions that we have for you. When you talk about this upcoming election, this is one of the most contentious elections I've ever seen. And it doesn't seem like it's getting any better. The closer we get to November 8th, it seems like the nastier things get. And I'm not saying that because I'm the only one looking at it. Everyone is saying the very same thing. Once we get to November 8th and the election turns out the way that we want it to, because everyone has heeded to their responsibility and they're going out and they're voting. And oddly enough, shamefully enough, I was with a group of fans the other day, and it's mind-boggling and disturbing that young people especially are saying they're not going to vote. They're not going to vote. And I think that is really a travesty, because they feel like, who am I going to vote for? I don't like him. I don't like her. But you can't get them to pinpoint one reason why they don't like her. And I could care less why they don't like him, but why they don't like her. Who is the lesser of the two evils? So,
well, I don't think we in the African American community can afford to talk about the lesser of two evils. We have to look at who will represent the concerns and interests of the good people in this country, and who will represent the interests of the millennial generation better. And when you line up the Republican nominee with the Democratic nominee, the Democratic nominee has more check marks in her favor than the Republican nominee. I think it's critically important that all across this country we do not demonize Democrats or Republicans, because after the election, November 8th, we still have to be Americans and work together. Now, as it relates to the millennial generation, the younger generation, and their discontent, one of the reasons they have discontent is because all adults sometimes discount their interests, meaning their ability to speak for themselves and lay out a foundation for their success. So my view is that young people must continue to take hold of their present and their destiny and speak for themselves, and older folks must, in some respect, get out of the way and let them have a pathway for their self-determination. In terms of the two political candidates, the Democratic nominee, Hillary Rodham Clinton, offers a better opportunity for that than Donald Trump. Donald Trump is a narcissist. What I mean by that is that everything that he says is focused on him. And he is surprised by his own success. I think the man is brilliant. I don't think it's worth demonizing him. I think he's brilliant. I just think he's self-focused and not focused on the interests of our country. I think we have a better opportunity having Hillary Rodham Clinton as our president to focus on the interests of all Americans, whether they be independents, Democrats, or Republican. And we have someone who has been in the trenches for the past, really, 45 years in the trenches, all the way back with working with Marion Wright Edelman in terms of concerns for children, going into the Deep South, finding out and documenting racist behavior directed towards children. I mean, what more in terms of a foundation do we want in a leader, that our leader has a concern for the interests and welfare of all children? Is she a perfect candidate? Absolutely not. But we've never had a perfect candidate, and the only one, for those who believe in the Christian belief of perfect, it was Jesus Christ.
Mm-hmm.
But even if you don't believe in Jesus Christ, the fact that you're looking for a perfect person, the possibilities are very limited. So we take a flawed candidate, and all of the candidates have had flaws, but this particular candidate, Hillary Rodham Clinton, is best prepared to lead our country with a steady hand, unflappable, can't ascribe misogynistic language towards her. You cannot ascribe that she is not prepared. She is probably the most prepared person who has ever run for the presidency, not because simply John Kennedy from little old Pasadena says that. Almost every responsible leader in this country, whether they like Hillary Rodham Clinton or not, believes she is qualified, ready on the first day to lead this country, and has a background that suggests the same. On the other side of the aisle, the Republican, we cannot say that.
No.
That person has been focused on raising money, filing bankruptcy, dishonoring women, dishonoring a legacy where women are equal to men, not more than or less than, but equal to in terms of leadership.
At least,
At least. So, I mean, I could go on and on why young people need to get excited in these last days to push Hillary Rodham Clinton clearly into victory, because we all have question marks. The Republican nominee has suggested that somehow the election could be stolen. That's a call to stupidity for his supporters to do dumb things that are un-American.
Right.
We have to stick together, whether we're Republican, Democrat, or independent, or decline to state, for this country. Country before Donald Trump's idiocy.
Yeah. Right. And as you said, we're not going to have a perfect person. There are no perfect people. And look at our current president. He has had 2 terms. And if we want perfection, in my view, he's as close as we're going to get to perfect. He's as close as we are going to get to perfect. And it's unfortunate that people expected him to be perfect, to step into the White House and do all of these things specifically for black people, and they turned their nose. They decided that he was not the president that they thought. They decided that he wasn't going to do anything for black people. And we constantly are saying, what did you expect him to do? Did you think he was going to knock on your door and say, here, this is for you, come with me? No, that was not going to happen. So what he did or did not do for black people, he did a great thing for black people. He made it to the White House, and we put him there.
Exactly.
He can't do it by himself. Go ahead. I don't want to get on my bandwagon, because I will, but go ahead.
Yeah, and Councilman, we all know that from a political standpoint, there's only so much a president can do. A president can, try to work with Congress, try to enact some legislation that, helps everyone across the board, and in that helping black people to, have a level playing field, and not be, set with situations that don't allow us to progress as we should. But again, the president only being able to do a certain amount of things, what are some of the types of things that community leaders can do, some people in the community at the grassroots level? What are the types of things that we can do to make sure that we're still progressing, that we're teaching our kids, we're making sure that the kids understand who they are and their potential? So if you could speak to, what is it, the types of things that you think we can do?
Fundamentally, we as a people must continue to recognize that a quality education is the most powerful equalizing force in the universe, and it is consistent with higher religious beliefs. And all of the major religions require preparation for leadership and for life. So our number one priority in terms of family structure, moving forward from whether it's a nuclear family or a new family, is education. We as a people, not just black people, but all people in America, particularly for the poor whites, poor Latinos, poor Asians, poor African Americans, must focus on obtaining a quality education. Poverty can be a unifying cry if we take race out of the equation, but our country oftentimes refuses to allow us to take race out of the equation. Hear me when I say a quality education for all has to be a remedy for a significant amount of the societal problems that our country and our world happens to be facing. Something recently happened that was monumental. AT&T CEO Randall Stephenson, talking to his top executives in that huge Fortune 500 company, soon to become a Fortune 10 company, said the following: "Our communities are being destroyed by racial tension, and we're too polite to talk about it." Now, this is the CEO of one of the largest telecommunication companies in the world, and he is saying that. So since he's saying that, and he happens to be white, he allows the President of the United States and all leaders in this country who were reluctant to talk about race because there's a segment in the white community that will label you less than. The CEO, Randall Stephenson, went on to say that we shouldn't be just teaching tolerance, meaning
Absolutely.
that
That's right.
you can be over there and I can be over here, just don't come over on my side of the table. He says
that's what tolerance means.
Tolerance is for cowards.
Yes, it
He
is.
says tolerance for cowards. This is the President, CEO, Randall Stephenson of AT&T. He says being tolerant requires nothing from you but to be quiet and not make waves.
That's right.
And we can't do that.
It only means I put up with you for the moment. That's all
For the
it
moment.
means. That's
Councilman.
all it means. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yes, this is Scotty, the show engineer. I have a question for you right before we hit the halfway mark and go to our break. But Randall Stephenson, I actually I do a 2-minute audio commentary about social political issues that, I send out to some of our media partners. And he was the subject of one, after he said that about Black Lives Matter, and, I listened to his whole entire speech. Now, the film, The 13th, just came out, and it documents the transformation of slavery to the prisons. With the exception clause in the 13th Amendment. We actually have programming that focuses on prison slavery here in this country as legalized by the 13th Amendment. As we know, Ava DuVernay just came out with the 13th, but we've been talking about that for 4 years on this network. Now, AT&T uses prison slave labor, and I actually made up a petition. It didn't get much traction. A couple of hundred people signed it, but it went straight to him. And I thanked him for saying what he said. And I said, he's right. People don't want to have these uncomfortable conversations. So I said, let's have this uncomfortable conversation about AT&T using prison slave labor. And in the 1990s, as a move against unionized labor, that is when they started exploiting prison slave labor. So you're utilizing prison slave labor in your business practices, and we know prisons are disproportionately filled with black people. But like you said, and I love your language about being codified, and even if it is about race, not mentioning race, because we got white people, we got Native Americans, we got Hispanics that are in prison and are victims of prison slavery. So that it's not really a question, but do you think that he needs to respond to why he's using prison slave labor? And then a lot of times these companies won't hire these people when they have a felony status, but will utilize them while they're in prison.
Excellent analysis, excellent points that you're making. So let's go back a little bit further. In terms of the health and wealth of this country was built off of slave labor, not just slave prison labor, but before you got prison slave labor, you had slave labor in society as a whole. And what I mean by that is you took people who white people wrote into the Constitution were less than human, not a full person. You gave them no rights. You could physically destroy them, meaning you could kill them if they didn't do what you said with no repercussions. You could kill them with impunity, and you didn't have to pay them to build. Mm-hmm. And what did black people build? It's been acknowledged that we built the U.S. Capitol. It's been acknowledged that we built the White House.
The White House. Mm-hmm.
It's been acknowledged that we actually built some of the major companies on Wall Street because they used the money from the South, from slave labor, to build certain financial institutions in the North.
Right.
So a study has been put together by economists in terms of reparations for the stolen labor. It would amount to approximately $7 billion. So Randall Stevenson has been called out by you, and we want to celebrate the fact that he is welcoming a dialogue more than just tolerance about the issue. One of his closest friends, a gentleman by the name of Chris, shared with him recently for the first time the difficulties he has experienced as an African-American man in this country. They hung out at each other's homes, and he, meaning Randall Stevenson, who happens to be white, never knew all these negative things that had happened to his friend who happens to be black. They spent the night, families spent the night at each other's homes, learned all these things that were not built on the fundamentals of race and racism, but just built on two people communicating, two families communicating to one another. And when his African-American buddy, homeboy, opened up and said, you know, these are the things that I've been experiencing: systematic racism, institutionalized racism, things that happen to me as a black man don't happen to you.
Mm-hmm.
So in terms of what you're raising, we need to take that message directly to Randall Stevenson and say, let's have a discussion about it. When he was talking to his audience, meaning Randall Stevenson, the CEO of AT&T, he quotes his buddy Chris. He says, when a parent says, I love my son, you don't say about your daughter. When you don't say, well, what about my daughter? it's assumed that you, of course, love your daughter.
That's
He
right.
said, when we walk or run the breast cancer funding and research, we don't say, what about prostate cancer? It's assumed that you're talking about all cancer. When the president says, God bless America, we don't say, shouldn't God bless all countries? No. And when a person is struggling on what's been broadcast on our airways and says, Black Lives Matter, we should not say, quote, all lives matter to justify ignoring the real need for change. This is not John Kennedy or the other commentators on this line. This is a white man who runs one of the largest corporations in the world saying Black Lives Matter. His name is Randall Stevenson, who just recently announced an approximately $84 billion acquisition of Time Warner. Why is that important? The reason that is important is if that acquisition goes through, it will be the largest acquisition ever, to the best of my knowledge, in the history of the world. Now, that's one piece of information, but the other piece of information is the following. He will control, AT&T will control content. This program that we are on today has content. You and I and our interchange of information creates content. Someone's hearing, someone may be learning, someone may be digesting the information and making or making conclusions, reaching conclusions. So you have AT&T about to be able to what? Massage and change the minds of billions of people, not millions, billions of people, because they will control Time Warner Cable and all the other tangential businesses that are attached to that merger. That's power. That's significant power, because if you own the minds, if you can control the minds, you can control everything. You can control everything in society. So it's very important when you raise the question of slave labor in the prison pipeline that we have this conversation not only with Randall Stevenson, the CEO of AT&T, but other companies, small and large, who use slave labor to build their companies, but will not allow someone with a felony on their record to be employed by their company and receive a fair wage as opposed to no wage at all. So you're on the right track. Don't give up. Use the platform you have to share the views that you've just shared on this program. They are relevant, they are important, and I'm so happy that the CEO
This service is provided in high definition by freeconferencecallhd.com. This conference is being recorded. Q&A session started.
With Kenny Hendricks and Councilman John J. Kennedy from Pasadena 3rd District. Thank you very much for listening.
Let me get off that blue dial numbers real quickly. If you want to get in on the conversation, you can dial area code 71. Oops, I didn't have it in front of me.
704.
I'll get that for you guys. I'll get that for you. If you would like to comment, give us a call at 641-715-3660. The participant code 549032 #. Once you're inside the conference line, to enter into the caller's queue to speak, just hit *6 and 1. We'll be right back. listening to Change Matters Solutions on Black Talk Radio, hosted by Kenny Hendricks and Colette Williams.
Welcome back to Change Matters Solutions. This is Kenny Hendricks. We are having a very lively conversation with Councilman John Kennedy from Pasadena, California, and we're going to go ahead and continue this conversation.
Great, thank you. And I am Colette Williams, and we are in great conversation with Councilman John Kennedy from Pasadena, as Kenny Hendricks just said. We do have more questions for you, and one of the things that you mentioned was Black Lives Matter. And my question to you was, do Black Lives Matter? And I think you've answered that quite eloquently, and we all appreciate that. And one of the things I want to ask you is, do you think that the BLM resembles the Black movement or the Panther movement back in the 60s? Is there any resemblance? How different is it? How is it stronger now than it was then? What do you think about that?
If we recall, the Black Panther movement initially in Oakland, California, was a way for the community to be self-determinant, meaning awful things were happening in the Black community, not just in Oakland, California, but across the country. And young people came together to say, what can we do to be a part of a new destiny, to make a new way for our people? And so if the truth is told, the program was one of, yes, demanding legitimate rights under the Constitution, two, providing educational opportunities for people of color, communities of color, particularly African Americans. And when I talk about African Americans, let me just be totally clear that the African American plight in this country is tied to the plight of all people in this country. The whole civil rights movement is a movement that alleviates the vestiges of evil from not just African Americans, but all Americans. And what I mean by that, before we get back to the Black Panthers and Black Lives Matter, is that what is good in terms of the constitutional movement that black people from Howard University, Harvard, Charles Hamilton, Houston, Thurgood Marshall, Spotswood Robinson, Wiley Branton, and others, in terms of fighting those Supreme Court cases, those legal challenges to institutionalized racism under the law, it was about freeing, yes, black people, Negroes at the time, but black people, African Americans, but it freed a society, it freed a nation, and that freedom isn't full at this point in the juncture of the baking, maturation of American society. It's still a fight that is daily for the playing field of life to be leveled. But in some respect, it goes even beyond Rosa Parks. It came much before Rosa Parks. It was Nat Turner. It was Native Americans standing up and saying in the Dakota area that you, by treaty, promised us 60 million acres, and today, in 2016, there's only 5 million acres dedicated, when the treaty says that 60 million of our land needs to stay with us, even though we're sharing with you, national government, United States of America. And so one Native American Indian chief would say that we we, not us personally, but our government would love to make treaties, but every treaty that we've made with the Native Americans has been broken. So when I talk about African Americans, I'm not talking just about our story. I'm talking about the American story, and I'm particularly talking about a story where minorities have been treated unfairly. But rapidly, this country is moving in exponential terms to a majority-minority country. And so our concerns must be recognized, and we must, as a nation, talk to one another and resolve conflict. That's important. Now back to the Black Panther movement and the Black Lives Matter movement. They are both originating with young people taking control of their destiny, creating a platform for change. And the Black Panthers movement was to provide food for the community, shelter for the community, and education for the community. It just so happens that that particular movement believed in the Second Amendment, the full measure of the Second Amendment, in terms of being armed to protect oneself. The Black Lives Movement has not moved under any Second Amendment. They've moved under the First Amendment, the right to peaceable protest, the right to reform government. And I think there are parallels, but the Black Lives Movement is fundamentally based on you must recognize that there is a racist society, that institutional racism has negatively impacted our community, and that we, not just black people, but we as a society must have redress and must have change where people are treated fairly. Now, as it relates to the Black Lives Matter movement and as it relates to policing in our country, the president of the International Association of Chiefs of Police, I think it was 2 Mondays ago, the organization which I used to be a member of, International Association of Chiefs of Police, 26,000 strong, 16,000 strong at their conference in San Diego. Terrence Cunningham from Wellesley, Massachusetts, apologized for the dark side of our shared history, end quote, that must be acknowledged and overcome. This is one of the most conservative policing organizations in this country, and is acknowledging that police have done bad to minorities, and particularly he's talking about African Americans, and he's apologizing. He's putting it on the line. He's putting it on the line for himself, the police department that he personally represents in Wellesley, Massachusetts, and he's putting it on the line for that organization, the International Association of Chiefs of Police. The president of one of the largest police organizations in the world on that particular Monday apologized for the historical mistreatment of minorities, and again, calling it, quote, the dark side of our shared history that must be acknowledged and overcome. And why is that important? You say, well, words don't matter. Words do matter. Yes, words do matter, because from the words create a platform for change to take place. Now, he goes on to say, he says, while we obviously cannot change the past, it is clear that we must change the future. But I would change that dialogue by saying the following. while we obviously cannot change the past, it is clear that we must change the present so we can get to the future.
Mm-hmm. John, you mentioned when you were talking about the Black Panthers, you mentioned the Second Amendment. I live in Texas now, although I grew up in Pasadena. I live in Texas now, and obviously Texas is very different with regard to gun control than California. Very strict laws in California, very liberal laws with regard to guns in Texas. And I'm a gun owner, and I carry a concealed handgun license. What are your thoughts with regard to black people arming themselves as a whole, exercising our Second Amendment rights? We look at what's going on with the alt-right and other folks on the right who are arming themselves basically to the T. I go to a lot of gun shows, to gun ranges, and I see a lot of people who are afraid that Hillary and Barack Obama were going to take their guns, so they're buying up guns by the dozens. But I don't see a lot of black people arming themselves. Do you have any thoughts with regard to the whole thing about black people arming themselves?
Well, first of all, Barack Obama or Hillary Clinton or any president of the United States does not have the right to take away gun ownership for private citizens. The Second Amendment allows for private citizens to own guns. Reasonable regulation for gun ownership and use is allowed. I am not one that would encourage African Americans to wholesalely go out and purchase guns with the belief that somehow that's going to resolve the issues affecting African Americans. That is not in any way. However, having said that, during the Civil Rights Movement, according to Charles E. Cobb, Jr., in a book, This Nonviolent Stuff Can Get You Killed, his position was, during the Civil Rights Movement, there are a significant number of African Americans in the South that protected rights by the threat of violence, not the use of violence, that they were armed and ready to protect their communities by any means necessary. That's one view that has been documented in the book, again, This Nonviolent Stuff Get You Killed. And I misspoke. The preface is by Charles E. Cobb, Jr. But anyway, it documents those folks who were African American who helped protect the nonviolent movement of Dr. Martin Luther King. I am a proponent of nonviolence. However, I believe the Second Amendment allows Americans to own guns, and I support the Constitution.
And so, since the Second Amendment says that, wonder if everybody's going to run out and get a gun now.
Well, I don't know that everybody has to.
So.
Yeah,
of course not.
Yeah, I think people can exercise their Second Amendment rights if they feel they need to do that. I have a right-wing friend who thinks pretty much that everybody should have a gun, and he says if everybody, because we got into a conversation about open carry and people carrying guns, and he felt that if everybody carried a gun, it'd be a lot better and a lot more people would, because people aren't trained. I told him people aren't trained.
Yeah.
And he said, but if everybody carried, they'd get trained. And I said, no, they're not.
No,
they wouldn't.
No, that's
because
bad.
anybody that wants to be trained now is trained. They're going to the range. They're going.
Right.
They got their license. So just because you tell everybody you can go do it doesn't mean everybody's going to go out and do it and get trained. But I just think that
let me be clear in what I've said, because I don't think I've been clear. Gun ownership does not make you safer as a community. If that, we know that just by looking at countries where handguns particularly, but in some countries, all guns are outlawed. The only folks who have guns are the folks who are supposed to be protecting the community. So, and those particular countries that have such requirements and laws are actually safer than the United States. So the Constitution allows it. So I'm suggesting that if the Constitution allows it, that is a right that cannot be taken away. Now, if the American people want to repeal the Second Amendment, that's their right. However, the Constitution allows folks to bear arms, but that is not a panacea to safety by any measure, in my view. That's just my view.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It is. There are no panaceas out there, and this is particularly is not. But if we look at, for example, some of the inner cities, Chicago, Detroit, and areas like that, where we have rampant violence, but we have very strict gun laws. And conversely, we have other areas where they have very liberal gun laws, and you don't have that sort of violence at the same level. So I think there's some correlation between the fact that, for example, in Texas, we don't have a lot of carjackings. Because if you try to jack somebody's car, you never know whether they're carrying a gun or not. And you might have those sorts of things in areas with stricter gun laws. So I understand exactly where you...
My view is a little different again. In an organized, civilized society where we have educated all people irrespective of race and economic factors, the need for open carry or concealed carry becomes minimal, de minimis. What happens is that there are a whole host of other society ills operating. Chicago, you mentioned. Look at the correlation between lack of high school education and violence. Look at the correlation between where the guns come from, who are the manufacturers of the guns, and the price points at which you can purchase a handgun. Look at crack cocaine and other drugs, and look at how certain types of drugs are criminalized more than other types of drugs. And we're only now starting to deal with that as a society. As an example, under the former Attorney General of the United States, Eric Holder, we started to see sentencing reform, where at one point the same grams of crack cocaine and powder cocaine disproportionately higher sentencing for crack cocaine than powder cocaine. Why was that? Because of racism. What do you mean racism? You can't point to me, wow, that's racist. Well, it just so happens that black folks weren't using cocaine. They were using other types of drugs because powder cocaine was too expensive for the majority of black people to use at a time when it was rampant. And so the crack cocaine gave you a pure form of the cocaine that would get into the nervous system, get into the bloodstream a lot faster than powder cocaine. And so the impact was stronger. And also the sentencing was disproportionate and unequal. As an example, someone with powder cocaine convicted of a crime could get less than a year. Someone with crack cocaine, triple, quadruple the amount of prison time. That's because whites were using powder cocaine and people of color had this new epidemic of crack cocaine forced upon minority communities. And I did say forced upon minority communities. So, but all of this, all of the conversations we're having today, we can point back to how do we deliver a quality education, irrespective of race and economics, to every child in America. That's the critical piece of this.
Right.
Because children are not, babies don't come into the world and say, I hate black people, or I hate white people, or I hate brown people. Ignorance teaches this.
That's right.
Ignorance teaches this. Ignorance teaches this. Now, as it relates to violence, which we have not centered on in this conversation, but violence in America is being taught. And most men in this country would disagree with what I'm about to say. But football teaches boys, young boys, irrespective of color, how to be violent. But the narrative is football teaches discipline, character, team sport, etc.
That's right.
But the reality is it's teaching young people how to resolve problems with violence, because you cannot turn the switch on when you're on the gridiron to do violence to your opponent and then turn it off when you're in society and say, when you hit me, mentally hit me, I'm not supposed to respond with violence. That takes a unique human being to be able to get on the gridiron, play football, seek to destroy his opponent, then get off and turn the switch and say, oh, everything is going to be all right, we can love each other, kumbaya. It doesn't work that way. Now, as it relates to the National Football League, to the best of my knowledge, I have not seen an African-American owner, meaning a true 50 plus 1% owner of a football team. So you have a group of men. I believe there's no more women owners, if I have this right. The last woman owner that I can recall was Frontiere.
Yeah, Georgia Frontiere, the owner of the Rams,
Right.
yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, she died several years ago when I think Kroenke, who moved the Rams from St. Louis is moving the Rams from St. Louis to Inglewood, purchased the team from that family, the Frontiere family. But that sport is likened to ancient Rome when slaves, discarded human beings, animals, and gladiators fought in the Colosseum for their freedom. And so young African-American boys and poor whites and others, minorities, play the game of football with the expectation that somehow they're going to buy their mother and parents this wonderful existence where they have a beautiful home, the newest cars, and et cetera. But they find out that 90%, this is other folks' statistics, I've not done the research, but 90% of all, this is an extrapolation, this is an extrapolation that 90% of all college football players have some form of brain injury after they stop playing the game.
Yes, they do. Yes.
Well, the body wasn't meant to take that sort of abuse at a kind of consistent basis.
Right.
Then when you move beyond the college player and go to the NFL, they are now doing studies about the brains, because certain athletes, instead of shooting themselves in the head, they shot themselves in the chest so their brains would be preserved so they could be studied. So we know that NFL players have a high indicia of brain injury as well. Now, the question is, if the game is not going to go away, how much money is the NFL putting into research to make the game safer?
Sir.
No,
Right, and I think the problem you run into is it's a business, and
Right.
people love the violence, and
right.
so
and it's
they
part of
are.
the entertainment industry.
Yeah, and so they sit on this fence that says, okay, we we're not necessarily, we don't want people to be injured, but that's part of the game.
Right.
And like right now, they have the concussion protocol that they send everybody through, but I guarantee you, a lot of people are not liking that because they're
Of
saying,
course not.
this is a violent game, and that's the way it goes.
that going in,
You're gonna
right.
get hit. Yeah.
This is
and I think a lot of things in our society. Businesses walk that fine line between what's business and what's for the good of the people. And most times they go on the side of business. They've got to make the money. They've got to make a profit for the shareholders.
This
and
is
it's all
Scotty.
about the money.
This is Scotty. We're actually at the end of our broadcast time, but I will extend.
No, we got more to talk about, Scotty.
Thank you. Don't go.
Scotty.
Yes.
We can't go now. It's getting real.
Yeah.
It's good. This is good. We can't go.
Yes, but we
This
do.
is Change Matter Solutions. We want to give a huge thank you to Councilman John J. Kennedy from Pasadena, California, for this outstanding conversation.
Ken,
and
before
his
he
outstanding
goes,
contributions to the community as a whole.
Ken, can you
Yeah.
hear me? Before he goes, I just have to ask him one last question, and then, of course, give everyone an opportunity to give their final statements before we wrap up. But my question to you, Councilman, you said something that really stuck in my mind. You said violence is taught. When we talk about violence in our society and in our particular focus, while we're not limited to our community, our demographic, our listening audience is the black community. So we're talking about places like Chicago and other inner cities now. I do want to acknowledge that I think lead poisoning has something to do with that, as well as a lack of an education. Studies on lead poisoning has shown that one of the symptoms is violence by that person. But in terms of violence being taught, I work with another organization out of the Chicago area called Clear the Airways Project. And then they, along with other groups around the country like Rage Against the Ratchet, they are saying violence is being taught to our youth through the violent lyrics in the music that is targeting our community.
Yeah, that's
and
true
they
too.
recently launched a campaign to turn off killer radio. That's what they called it, turn off killer radio, where we're asking people around the country, turn off this violent, misogynistic, criminal music on the public airways. We're not talking about censorship. We're talking about FCC licensed public airways that corporations have to apply for a license and are supposed to follow the rules of decency and obscenity. Your FCC has rules, and it is not being enforced. And they have also targeted McDonald's as being one of the primary sponsors of what we call murder music. And so I just would like to get your thoughts on, like, for example, Michelle Obama just gave First Lady Michelle Obama just gave a speech about the language of Donald Trump and how we don't want our children to hear that type of language. Now, take Donald Trump out the equation. She could have been talking about any of these urban radio stations that you'll hear that language every day.
They do it. They allow it. They allow it because it's...
Let me just say this. Words have power. Words have power. So if you feed me words that uplift and nurture me, I'm going to do better in life than if you feed me words of destruction and strife. So words have power. We teach violence. Children learn violence. So if we teach it, we can also teach to unlearn the violence. Adults are culpable for teaching babies and young people about violence, how to do violence, how to be racist, because racism is a form of violence. Racism, let me be clear, so everybody here can understand, and hopefully my black brothers and sisters aren't the only one listening. Hopefully some powerful people beyond my black brothers and sisters are listening. We can change the narrative where we're not teaching young people to do violence to one another. We can teach intentional civility, meaning when we have conflict, we are taught to resolve that conflict in a civil manner. We do not have to have urban warfare for folks who are going to war. We're not seeking war in urban cities, even though in some places in this country, war is raging. And generally that war that is raging is the same color on the same color, the same ethnic group on the same ethnic group.
Right.
And that's why some in the power part of our society, the top 10% can say, let them do that. If I remember a phrase from Francis Ford Coppola's The Godfather, where one of the characters says, let them do that let those blank people do that in their neighborhoods. The fact of the matter, though, is what happens in my neighborhood is eventually going to happen in your neighborhood. And we need to come together as a people, and I don't mean black people, I mean all people coming together and having that intelligent dialogue about the truth. Not some variation of the truth, but the truth. And once we start that dialogue, we can start as a community, and I mean the greater community, figuring out how are we going to resolve, change, make life better for all people, from the Native American to the folks who are here now, and to the folks, just like the black folks leaving the South for a better life, for those folks who come across the border seeking a better life. We have a opportunity to change the narrative. You change the narrative, you change lives, because words make a difference. And just like you recognize the misogynistic language, the murder language destroys. Let's change the narrative. Let's cut off those purveyors of hate and evil. Let's cut that off within the law. Let's cut that off within the law. I'm not saying outside of the law, within the law. Let's cut that narrative and that platform off and start teaching intentional civility. Intentional civility.
Thank you,
I don't know
Councilman.
why you all got me on this program today. I got so much I would like to share, and
well, you're not going anywhere.
Definitely.
You're not going anywhere. Don't think you do have so much to share. And I've got to interrupt. I'm sorry, Ken, but what I really wanted to say before we ended this show, and we both get something to say before we sign off. I have your bio sitting in front of me, which I offered you an opportunity to start talking, and we went on from there. And when I sent the bio to Ken, he said, wow, another heavy hitter. And John, you absolutely are, and I'll never forget the day that I met you when I was introduced to you while you were at the Edison Company, and I believe it was David that introduced us.
David
Ford. He said, this is John Kennedy. And I said, no, it isn't. And yeah, his name is John Kennedy. And the most profound things have come from you this morning. And I so appreciate the things that you have said in this dialogue. And it is absolutely amazing for me to listen to the things that you have to say about what's going on in our country, in our communities, and the things that we need to do. We've got 10 questions, and I sent those questions. And even without asking those specific questions, we've been able to at least touch on all of those questions. But it is really an honor to hear you speak. You're not going anywhere. And if Scotty cuts us off, we're still on the line. But but you have a lot to say. You have a lot to say, John. And this is not the first time I've heard you speak. I'm simply taken by the things that I'm hearing, because I know that the information is good, solid information. It's profound information. And some of the things that you have said are sentiments that I have even expressed. And to hear you validate my own feelings is really, for me, it's really, as I said, validation. And I really thank you for that, and it's a privilege for us to have you on the line. And I'm not going to keep talking because I will, and I'm going to turn it over to Ken real quick.
Well, I think we're, Scotty, are we at the end here?
Yes, I do have a schedule to keep, and I do believe I have a meeting with you two after. But I do want to say to the councilman, of course, the door is open to Change Matters Solution, but as the manager of this radio station, I just want to say that we have an open door policy for people like yourself. So anytime you want to come back on our various programs, just reach out to us, and we may be reaching out to you.
Absolutely, we will. We sure will. We absolutely.
And we'll definitely have the councilman back. Absolutely, absolutely.
Right.
Well, we want to again thanks John Kennedy, councilman from Pasadena, California, for having this amazing dialogue with us today on Change Matters Solutions. We do this every Tuesday at 8 o'clock. Every 8 o'clock West Eastern. What am I talking about? 8 o'clock Pacific time. 10 o'clock where I am in Texas. And, of course, 11 o'clock on the East Coast. We want to thank Scotty Reed, our manager and producer of the show. Again, this is Change Matters Solutions. I am Kenny Hendricks.
And I am Colette Williams. And thank you, John, from the bottom of my heart and also from my colleagues. Thank you so very much. We greatly appreciate your time and your desire to remain with us. We will have you back on the show. And as Scotty just said, you have the key to Black Talk Radio. And thank you for being a part of our show this morning. And I'm sure that our listening audience has received an earful, and I'm sure they feel, as I do, that this was absolutely a great hour and 15 minutes. We really, really appreciate it. So we are signing off. Go ahead, John.
I just want to say thank you for allowing me to come on. I know it had been a long time in the making. And then one of the next issues, if I'm invited to come back, I'd like to talk about economic growth in the African-American community and how we create wealth and sustain our communities.
You just got yourself a date. You just got yourself a date. And, John, I will tell you this. Our next show next week is a senator from Indiana, who's a former senator, state senator from Indiana, who is also in upper executive level of AT&T.
Wow.
And he's going to be on our show next week.
Wow.
So it would be fireworks if you're nearby.
Give us a call.
Yeah. So
okay.
it's going to be an interesting show. Next week is the election, so we will have a lively show next week. So stay close to your phones because we'll be calling on you.
Okay, power to all the people.
Absolutely.
To all the
power
people.
to the people. Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Take
Bye.
care.